Welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We're delighted that you're joining us to hear evidence-led discussion about topics that are critical to the way we manage our water, nature and climate. And a huge thanks to our sponsors Mackley, MWH Treatment and BMA, and you'll hear a little more about them later. We're really grateful for their support in bringing the pod to you. If you're new to Planet Possible, I'm Nikki Roach, an enthusiastic connector of people and ideas and a fellow of CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. Globally, and here in the UK, we're seeing a significant shift in the way our environment is talked about by politicians. And we regularly discuss the impact of that shift here on Planet Possible as it shapes legislation and policy change and arguably public perception about our environment. So in today's episode, we're going to think more directly about the politics that's driving this change, and my guest is perfectly positioned to explore this with us. In 2006, he was asked by the then Conservative Party leader David Cameron to co-head a review of the party's environmental policies. He first became an MP in 2010, was a candidate for the Mayor of London in 2016 and has held ministerial positions at DEFRA, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Department for International Development. He resigned from the government in June 2023 in opposition to the Conservative Party's disinterest in environmental policy. And with a lifelong commitment to conservation and the environment, he now sits in the House of Lords and works alongside a number of environmental foundations. So I am delighted to welcome to Planet Possible Lord Goldsmith of Richmond Park. Welcome, Zac.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. Let's start with your view on how the environment is being considered globally, and then maybe give me your environmental sort of state of the nation in a UK context.
You said in the intro, things are changing. Plates are moving all over the place. So on the one hand, you've got climate vulnerable nations or environmentally exposed nations around the world, and often poorer countries, for whom this stuff is existential. I mean, it's not an academic debate. You're seeing increasing organisation, coordination, mobilisation of those countries. I was just at Climate Week in New York at UN General Assembly, and it's really extraordinary to see the coming together of all these organisations. You had a group of all the Pacific small island states, for example. They are actively working to create the largest marine protected area on Earth. If you put it all together, if they pull it off, which they will, it'll be an area bigger than the surface area of the moon. So you've got huge ambition on one level. And then in the West, in parts of the West, you've got a new politics taking over, which has, in my view, completely misunderstood the issue. I'm going to say that environmental groups have a small role, a small nugget of responsibility here, is that we've allowed the environment, when we talk about the environment, to be reduced down to this single one-dimensional issue of carbon. And the effect is that the real environment, which is crucial for climate stabilization in any case, we have no future without forests, and the ocean plays an enormous role, as we saw in the David Attenborough film recently, has just been left to one side. So when this sort of new populist right decide that they don't like climate policy, they don't believe in climate change, they effectively chuck the whole environment issue in the bin. It's all gone, which makes no sense. There is a legitimate debate to be had about the solutions to climate change. You know, we could talk, and I'm sure we would find areas of disagreement. Do we like this policy or this policy? Is this one going to work best or that one? But what's happened is that the whole cause, the whole objective has been thrown out the window. I'm struggling as a conservative with very little in common with lots of conservatives who are steering the various ships today, is to remind those people that actually there's a long history of environmentalism on the sort of centre-right of politics, and that's true of America more than anywhere else. Teddy Roosevelt created all these huge national parks all over America. His speeches on the environment were unbelievably moving and poetic and heartfelt, extraordinary things. Even Richard Nixon, you know, we think only of Watergate, and not surprisingly, given the scandal at the time, but more environmental legislation was passed on his watch than any previous or subsequent president. So there's something mad has happened. All that stuff's been thrown in the bin. The Conservative Party's announced that it's effectively scrapping the Climate Change Act, which was a cross-party piece of legislation, not replacing it with anything as far as I can see, and no emphasis either on alternatives, a shift towards the natural environment, for example. It's just nothing. It's a sort of desert that we're looking at from the Conservative Party in the UK, which is crazy. It's damaging for lots of different things, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But that's the battle now, is to try and imbue our politicians with the sense that they can disagree about the solutions, that's fine, but we have one planet. If we allow the planet to wither, which is happening unbelievably quickly, we're seeing a plummeting biodiversity crisis, we're seeing rapid deforestation of the three great basins, the Amazon, the Congo, the Southeast Asia, 1 million hectares a year of the Congo is being lost, and there's no question over how disastrous that is. It's simply a fact that it is. The Congo produces most of the rainfall for Africa. Without the Congo, and we are looking at a world without the Congo if things don't change, you're going to have a humanitarian crisis on a scale that we've never even had to consider, which would sound absurd in any other context, but that is what we're looking at the moment. The Amazon provides rainfall that makes agriculture possible in the southern states of the United States of America. We are all dependent on the Amazon. We are all dependent on Congo, DRC, Congo Basin generally, and of course the forests of Southeast Asia are critical for our survival on Earth. So it's really not political in a party political ideological sense. The solutions are political, but the job of any serious political party has to be to come up with what it believes are the best solutions, not just to ignore the problem altogether. That is a disastrous policy, and unfortunately it is a policy which is gaining traction in certain places.
We always try and look for the positives on this podcast, but I do want to spend just another minute or two reflecting on how we got here, because as you say, the Conservative Party, certainly here in the UK, has always been quite environmentally ambitious, and it's now, you could almost argue that it's kind of anti-science, really. That's a really big swing. Zac, you are really close to this. You've spent a large part of your career in this world. How did we get here?
Parties basically want to get elected. Everything that an opposition party does, you could argue that most of what a government does, is about securing its position in the subsequent election on a very short-term basis. Elections come every few years, and long-term thinking is already quite difficult. And I think what the Conservative Party has done, it has interpreted popular anger over certain things as anger towards an entire suite of things. And the best example of that was, I think it was under Rishi Sunak, the last government that I served. I resigned from his government because I felt that it had just gone completely off the rails on these issues and was breaking promises to our allies around the world and really being disastrous. The moment of change under Rishi Sunak came in a by-election in Hillingdon, where it was believed that people were voting against the establishment, the Conservative Party, because of the clean air policies in London. So these affect cars. You pay more if you have a dirty car driving into London. Clean air policy, it's not really a climate change policy, it's about particulate matter in the air. But nevertheless, it was packaged up as a climate policy. People are voting against climate policy because Conservatives today seem to see climate as the environmental issue. This was a rejection of environmental policy, and therefore environmental policy goes in the bin. That same process continues under the current shadow administration. It's just a very superficial view. But when I was involved much more closely in the Conservative Party, either as an advisor or an MP and subsequently a minister, I would always have to have arguments, and there was always opposition. There were lots of support as well. But to deal with the opposition, I would commission surveys, polls, not from environmental focus groups, but mainstream organizations. And it is genuinely the case and demonstrable that no matter how you ask the question, and no matter who you ask, left, center, right, old, young, black, white, doesn't matter who you ask, rich, poor, everyone wants more nature. They want to see more nature, they want to be exposed to more nature, they want more environmental leadership, they want their rivers to be clean, they want biodiversity, they want to hear the birds singing, they want to be able to walk outdoors and experience nice things, and they want climate leadership. And there was a moment where the country was really proud of the climate leadership that we were providing around the world. They felt that it reflected well on us, particularly post-Brexit, where people were wondering, who are we? Where does the UK stand in the world? It's a failure to recognise that has left us in the position we're in, because fundamentally a lot of politicians, you would say the majority, there are lots of very good politicians, but there are a lot of politicians who are just purely opportunistic. They'll go where the wind blows or where they think the wind blows, and there's been a huge misreading, in my view, by today's politicians. And I think, by the way, the same is true in the US, where there's a sort of wholesale rejection of the natural environment. Now, it would be perfectly possible for the Trump administration, even while being climate skeptic, even while seeing climate change as a kind of big socialist conspiracy to have bigger government, more tax, more regulation, even despite all of that, it would be possible for them to say, let's have a plan for every river to be drinkable, swimmable, let's maximize our biodiversity, let's improve people's access. There's nothing left or right wing about that. It's what people want. And there's still a strong strain of that exists in the US. I talk all the time to Republicans, Democrats, politicians, businesses. This is across the board. So there's no inconsistency there ideologically. It's just a failure to recognize that. It's a kind of dumb politics of today where everything's reduced to a soundbite and complicated issues are reduced to one-dimensional tiny issues which are then thrown out casually. It's a battle.
Oh, there's a huge amount there. I mean, as you said, you resigned from the Conservative government in 2023 over, I guess, the direction of travel that we're now seeing playing out. What are your reflections on the performance of the current government that we have in the UK?
Just very quickly on the Conservatives, if I could. I mean, there was a particular issue which triggered. I'd had a very lucky time under Boris Johnson. I know people have different views on Boris Johnson, but he was a supporter of these issues. He was a champion of nature. And as a minister at the time, I was in 3 different departments at the same time. And I had a huge freedom to do, I thought, very exciting, good things, particularly around the natural environment. We hosted COP in Glasgow, COP26. It was the first COP where really nature was at its heart. We had the centerpiece was all around protecting forests. Until then, forests appeared in the fringes of COPs with scruffy forester experts in a tiny room, but not on the main stage. Here we had leader after leader after leader being required by us as hosts to make pledges on forests. This was Boris Johnson. I obviously had a role to play, but I wouldn't have been able to do any of that without Boris Johnson. And then under Liz Truss, it was a very short time. And the truth is, I wouldn't have survived that government for very long. But then it was replaced by Rishi Sunak. And I was committed to continuing to try to protect what had been done and try and make progress. I found myself not moving forward, more or less not moving backwards. It wasn't great, but I felt committed to lots of things that I still wanted to complete. But then there was a particular issue. We had made a pledge to double our international climate finance. We made that pledge before COP26. And on the back of that pledge, all the small island states and Commonwealth countries and climate vulnerable countries, our friends and allies on the whole, were really happy about that because it created a sort of chain reaction. Other countries stood up and they doubled their own commitments as well. And I remember going to the COP that Rishi Sunak attended, and I was still a minister. And there were leaders of these countries who I knew I'd been working with, Palau and Samoa and places like this, Caribbean countries, and they were furious. Nothing had been announced, the budget hadn't been cut, but all the rumours were that the government was going to go back on this promise about something for which, for them at least, is existential. And they were furious, and all the diplomatic niceties were out the window, and people were really angry. And I felt that it was such a betrayal. And that was bad enough, and I possibly could have stayed and fought my corner on that issue. But as a minister, I was being required to effectively lie in Parliament, to pretend that we weren't cutting the budget, when I knew from internal meetings and documents that the budget was going to be cut. It wasn't going to be a straightforward cut. Some of the budget was going to be redefined. We were going to redefine projects as to pretend they were environmental, which had nothing to do with the environment, so that we could create this sort of illusion that we were keeping our promise. But we weren't keeping our promise, and I wasn't willing to do that. So that was really the straw. I joined the Conservative Party at a time when it wasn't particularly green. They were trying to rediscover their green thread, their green roots. That's why I joined. If it had been a perfect party, I wouldn't have bothered joining. I would have done something else. There would have been no reason to. So I don't mind the challenge. That's what we all must do. As the late Jane Goodall said, we each of us have an impact on the earth, and it's our choice as to what kind of impact we want to leave. So I'm happy with the challenge, but it became intolerable.
BMA is a next-gen AI decision intelligence software company. Their cloud-based platform, Decisio, redefines how water and energy companies approach their infrastructure planning to make better, faster and more connected critical decisions, simultaneously achieving net zero, resilience and financial sustainability. Mackley is a civil engineering contractor specialising in water sector infrastructure, coastal projects and river works. Striving for a sustainable future, Mackley helps communities prepare better for climate change, maintain water security and enhance biodiversity. With a proud 98-year history, Mackley continues to skillfully tackle the most challenging and complex projects in water. Let's talk about the current Labour government that we have and how are they doing from an environmental perspective?
I mean, the truth is that there are probably more environmentally minded MPs in Parliament today than ever before. There are lots of new Labour MPs, people I work very closely with, I'm very friendly with, who are totally passionate, who care as much about these issues as you do and I do, listeners do. But there's no pressure on the Labour government. So when we were in government, I would often work with the opposition. I'd sort of hint that there were certain areas that if they pushed hard, they might win. And it would help me as a minister trying to get this stuff over the line. So we always felt pressure. It was a healthy, good pressure coming from the opposition. But the current government has no pressure on these issues from the opposition. If anything, it's a downward pressure, not an upward pressure. So that dynamic is gone. And as a result, the sort of sense that the government has to deliver on these issues doesn't really exist. So there are some good, really good people. Steve Reed was good in the Environment Department. David Lammy was excellent in the Foreign Office on these issues. He really cares about nature, and it is hard. It's not academic for him, and I've known him for years, and he's passionate about forests. He's now been moved, effectively downgraded. A deputy prime minister sounds great, but it is a demotion. The new Foreign Office doesn't seem to have anything like the same focus on global leadership on environmental issues. It sounds like Keir Starmer's not going to go to the Brazil COP. He'll be the first prime minister, as far as I remember, first British prime minister not to go to a climate COP. I suggest that's probably because he doesn't feel that he has anything to offer, but that's a political choice. That Brazil is doing some really ambitious things. It needs global support. And I find that when I talk to the Norwegian government, the German government, the Singaporeans, other countries as well, there's much more enthusiasm about supporting the President Lula agenda on the environment, on forests in particular, than we have here in this country, where it actually looks at the moment, unbelievably, that we're going to be one of the few donor countries not taking part in this very ambitious forest fund that Lula is trying to create to tip the balance financially in favour of protecting forests rather than destroying them. It doesn't look like the UK is going to be involved. I haven't given up on it. I know that people like David Lammy were very supportive, and I know that Steve Reed was very supportive, Ed Miliband very supportive, but the government as a whole is just not. So there's a worry for me about our kind of international commitments. A lot of that stuff just seems to be withering. The money is shrinking away to almost nothing. Lots of commitments we made before being quietly put on the shelf. So I do worry about that. Domestically, I think there has been some incremental improvements. There was a screening for the government, which strangely I was invited to, of a sort of 25-minute version of the David Attenborough film, Ocean. And Attenborough himself was there. Everyone was, including myself, in awe of the great figure. And Keir Starmer spoke afterwards, and obviously the main thesis of that film is about destroying our precious ocean environments. And he points out in the film that one of the most destructive things you can do is bottom trawling. And he pointed out that not only are we doing bottom trawling, we're doing it in areas that the public believe are protected. So we're destroying legally our marine protected areas. So his ask was very simple: just don't bottom trawl in protected areas. Ideally don't do it at all, but don't do it in your protected areas. That's a con, it's a fraud, and it's insane. And we had a pretty clear promise from the Prime Minister that he would solve that issue. And that was nearly a year ago. And we've had one announcement on the issue since then, which is a very, very partial reduction of the amount of bottom trawling in our marine protected areas. There's no financial reason not to just ban it. There is no political reason. In fact, there's huge political reasons to ban it, but it hasn't happened. And I don't understand that. So it feels to me like this is a very cautious government. It will do what it feels it's required to do, even despite the fact that there are some great champions in government, some really good people, new MPs, some I worked with before they became MPs, some of them I encouraged to become MPs, precisely for this reason. But the sort of general direction of government is pretty depressing. I'm not going to say it's disastrous, because I wouldn't say we're going backwards domestically, but we're definitely not taking advantage of the low-hanging fruit, the really easy things that could be done now that don't cost much money, if any at all, but which would yield huge, huge results for the natural environment, for biodiversity, ultimately for all of us. On the international stage, we are going backwards, there's just no doubt about it. Last week in New York, meetings around forests and oceans and Antarctica and all these different issues, all the key countries were there. It seems to me that UK wasn't even invited to some of those countries. In other areas, it just didn't turn up. So I found that very disappointing. And I think a lot of the brilliant people in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that I used to work with, and a couple of other departments as well, who really are brilliant. They are superb. I've seen them in action. I feel like there's a despondency there now, which makes me very sad. I saw our negotiators negotiating the High Seas Treaty. I think most of the country, which was put into law finally, we haven't legislated for it. We were the country, more than any other country, that pushed for it. And our negotiators negotiated it. We were the ones that got it over the line. These people whose names we'll never hear, the people in the back offices of government, but who do all the serious work, they delivered that High Seas Treaty. And yet 65, 70 countries have signed up, not the UK. We haven't legislated. We said we will at some point, but there's no date. We should have been the first country to do it. I've seen our negotiators negotiating around plastics treaty. Other countries openly celebrated the role of our British negotiators from DEFRA. We led the charge on finance for forests, for the Congo Basin, for indigenous people protecting their forests, for the Amazon, on finance for the environment generally. and we're going backwards. Other than America, which effectively closed down USAID, we are the country that's sort of second in line in terms of the severity of the pullback on financing these sorts of issues. And it is reversible, but right now it's looking a bit grim. My hope, I'm going to say this very politically, because this is going to annoy various people, but my hope is that as Deputy Prime Minister, David Lammy, he's also Justice Minister, but as Deputy Prime Minister, he, I hope, would be able to find a way to create a role. It's a sort of weird role. It's a bit like Vice President in the US. It's what you make of it. I don't understand the role, but I've never been Deputy Prime Minister, but my hope is that he will be able to carve out a role as Deputy Prime Minister to continue to champion those things on which he was making huge progress. And he really was against the odds, against his own government in some respects. He doesn't take his own government on publicly, but he was fighting all of our corner on nature in a way that was very effective, very passionate, very compelling. And I think around the world, when you ask people in this sort of world of environmental politics, of forests, indigenous people, etc., who in the UK political system right now, who in government is your champion, almost all of them would say David Lammy. They've heard him speak, they've seen his efforts. So I hope somehow we don't lose that as he goes from the Foreign Office to Deputy Prime Minister. There is some hope there. I think he'll be able to. I hope so.
Fascinating to hear your take on it. We had Piers Forster, who's the chair of the Climate Change Commission, come and join us, and he talked really positively last year about the Brazil team wanting to mirror what we've set up with the Climate Change Commission. And actually, as you say, on the back of trying to find our identity, I think, in the world after leaving Europe, you would hope that there was an opportunity for us to do that with some amazing sort of pedigree in doing the right thing for the environment. So it's really stark, Zac. It's really candid, and it's fascinating to hear what's happening on the inside, really.
Just on the Brazil thing, I think the news is the news and it covers things that are day to day. But what Brazil is trying to do is monumental. You think the financial incentive to destroy the Amazon, for example, is around 40 times greater than the incentive to protect the Amazon, because the global economy, the market economy, just doesn't recognize the value of nature, even though we depend on it, until it's been converted into toilet paper or whatever else. And he's trying to change that ratio. And he's proposed the creation of a fund, huge fund, $125 billion fund, which would generate income for those countries that have managed from the previous year to not lose forest. But this is a commercial fund. It's not grant money. This isn't donations. It will be a fund that invests the 125 billion, generates returns for the investors, but also for the forest countries. So for a country like the UK, they're not asking us to grant money to this. It's called the TFFF. I wish these names were better. They're not asking for a donation. They're not asking for aid. They're asking the UK simply to underwrite an amount of money. Norway's going to do it. Germany's going to do it. China's going to do it. I mean, it's the first time they've involved in this sort of thing. The Brazilian government itself has put its money where its mouth is. They've announced $1 billion. But this isn't grant money. It's an investment. They're not going to lose that money. It'll come back. It may not be gigantic returns on their investments, sort of venture capital style, but it's money that is going to be a massive impact. And if they can pull this fund off, and if they really succeed in doing it, I think they will. They're struggling because of the lethargy among countries like our own. But if they manage to pull it off, and a lot of us, myself included, doing everything we can to try and help them, this will have the single biggest impact on climate, on biodiversity, on nature, on indigenous people who really are the ultimate guardians of the natural world, and fundamentally for all of us. And it just feels to me that we have no choice but to support this initiative. It is the only thing in town that has any prospect of really shifting the dial in favour of keeping forests alive. It is the only idea that is big and audacious and bold enough, and we've got to make it work. It just feels to me that a responsible, serious country, fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world, talks a lot about the importance of nature and forests. We just can't not be supporting this. It would just be absolutely extraordinary. The other point is that even this kind of resurgent movement on the right to reject climate change, and at the very least climate change policies, very few people you'll meet on the left or the right have anything other than a recognition that we need to protect these forests. Everyone understands that. I've heard Nigel Farage talking about the need to protect these forests. I mean, this is not something where the Labour Party is going to lose ground. I mean, it's just not a political cost. It's not a financial cost. It just seems to me that this is a really easy win for the world. It's not going to hinge on the UK. It's always been expected by Brazil that we would play a significant role and not just always leave things to Norway, which we seem to do.
So how do you make the case to Treasury that nature, climate, water challenges need funding?
On an international scale, it's about diplomacy. A lot of other countries are pressuring the UK, politely asking. We had a fantastic event of former presidents and prime ministers in New York. A sort of gang has formed to apply political pressure and try and drive this forward. So that's kind of politics, really. On the domestic front, this is the thing, it's not even about extra cost. So take flooding, for example. Talk to the UK about UK issues. People are aware of biodiversity loss and they're aware of flooding because it ruins communities, it turns lives upside down, it costs a huge amount of money, and it's terrifying. Best way of dealing with flooding is not endless concrete barriers and channels and speeding the water through the land. It's about protecting the landscape. And we know that only 1% of a water catchment, so water, is in the river. The 99% of the water is in the land. So if you want to slow the flow of river, prevent it from swelling out of control and destroying communities downstream, what do? You improve the sponginess of the land at the top of the catchment area. And you do that by planting trees on slopes. A slope that's planted in trees compared to a slope that's grazed by sheep, the difference is about 100 to 1 in terms of its absorbability of water. You look after your peatlands, which are effectively giant sponges. You do everything you can to improve the ability of the land to hold water during the winter and not release it in floods, and also retain that water, or a lot of that water, during the summer to reduce the impact of drought, of dry spells. It actually doesn't cost very much money. And you could say it would certainly save money in terms of the solution. It would 100% save money in terms of insurance costs, 100% save money in terms of cleanup costs further downstream. But even more than that, we already pay landowners huge amounts of money every year. If you own land, you get subsidies. The trouble is the subsidies at the moment are not geared towards looking after the land in the common good. So there is a very simple principle, which should be a very conservative principle, which is you don't get public money unless you deliver a public good. Farm your land in a way that boosts biodiversity, allows underprivileged people to access the countryside, slows the flow of water during the winter, holds the water during the summer. This is a common good. This is a public good. And if you own land and you do those things, they're not going to be recognized by the conventional market, so it merits support from government. That's the principle. That should be the principle. I don't think anyone can really argue with that. So it's not even more money. It's about spending that money in a slightly different way. And that's true globally, by the way. I mean, you ask scientists today, what is it going to cost to turn the tide on nature destruction? And the figure that's normally used is $500 billion a year to turn the tide. That sounds like a lot of money. It's a fraction of what we spend on soft fizzy drinks every year globally. But nevertheless, it's 500 billion. It's still a lot of money. But at the same time, the top 50 food-producing countries spend $500 billion a year of public money subsidizing landowners, normally to do very destructive things. So the solution isn't to go and find new money. If you were to shift that money away from funding bad things towards supporting stewardship of the land, you've got twice as much money as you need, because you're taking away the damage and adding 500 billion to. I know it's not that simple. Of course, it's never going to be that simple, but that is the direction to travel we should be moving in. It's not always about writing checks, taxing people more to do more things. It's about spending existing money more effectively. Fishing is the same. It's one of the most subsidized industries of all. The people that are on the screens of the Attenborough film and Ocean, who are destroying whole systems, catching hardly any fish, by the way, but still destroying whole systems, they're not just doing that in the ocean or even in marine protected areas. They're paid by us to do it. Anyone on this who's watching this thing who pays their taxes is paying for the destruction of those marine protected areas. Why? Why should we be doing that? How difficult would it be for a government to say, we're going to shift that, we're going to switch those subsidies? And there are blocks in the system. There's a lot of lobbying by vested interest. I saw that in government. We didn't get that done. We got a lot of stuff done for the sort of the years that Boris Johnson was there, but we didn't get that done. I wasn't a fishing minister, but I often tried trespassing into this area because it drove me mad that we were effectively lying to people about protected areas in the ocean. But it isn't difficult. It's a political decision. The vast majority of people in our fishing communities, they're not benefiting from destroying the ecosystems. On the contrary, wherever you have protection, real protection, fish stocks go up, incomes improve, more jobs are created. It's a great thing for the environment, which is why, and I'm going to be making this pitch to the government in the next few days, is that the country that has the most number of marine protected areas, it's not the biggest area, but the most number of individual protected areas, is the Philippines. It's quite a new thing. And it's because the Philippines said, instead of the government deciding where we're going to protect water and then imposing it on communities who may feel threatened by it, even if ultimately they'll benefit, they may feel threatened by it, they flipped it on its head and said any fishing community can establish its own protected areas and the government will support it and finance the initial stages. So suddenly it was an empowering thing rather than a threat. And as a result, you saw this happen happened, this happened, this happened. Fish stocks began to improve. And now in the Philippines, it's completely accepted by the fishing world, the fishing communities, the coastal communities, that these are very good for the environment, but also for their livelihoods. And as a result, they're flourishing. We should have the same system in the UK, to be honest. It completely takes the politics out of marine protected areas. And you suddenly find that the people who are always held up as being opposed, who often aren't that opposed, but they're nevertheless used as the kind of stick to bash these kinds of policies by the bigger industries that fear change. It would flip it on its head. I guess a very long-winded way of saying that environmental policy, if it's done properly, isn't unpopular. It can and should and would improve lives and livelihoods as well as improving the environment. And there are so many examples of that around the world. We could talk for 2 hours about things that I was lucky enough to see as the minister when I travelled, and I saw things which I couldn't believe. A logging area in Congo, the Republic of Congo. I was taken there slightly reluctantly. I thought it would be miserable to go to an area that had been logged twice. And I walked through a forest. I couldn't see any signs of logging, virtually no signs of logging. Biggest population of gorillas anywhere in the Congo Basin, biggest population of forest elephants anywhere in the population, and a prosperous community, people with free electricity, free energy. Because the way they do it, they've got a very strong forest code. It's 2 trees for every 3 hectares over 25 years. So it kind of almost mimics nature. Everything is used. The wood chip creates the power. They don't sell raw timber anymore, which doesn't go for very much. They manufacture stuff. So the communities have been trained to do that. You can buy a flat pack house there now. So suddenly they're cutting fewer trees down and employing vastly more people, much bigger contribution to the Congolese economy, and nature's winning. I mean, if all logging was like that, logging wouldn't be a problem in the world. There are so many examples of regions, in some cases whole countries, getting it right. The trouble is it's not all happening under one umbrella. There's nothing we need to invent. It's all happening. It's just in pieces around the world.
MWH Treatment is one of the UK's leading water and wastewater process contractors. MWH offers a truly integrated design and build service that's uniquely dedicated to the water industry. With an innovative and future-facing approach, everything MWH does is guided by its purpose to shape a better world. It strikes me, one of my reflections from listening to you talk is that once we start to look at a little bit of detail and we get away from this binary, if you care about the environment, that might be a threat to jobs, and we actually help people understand the stories of if we do things differently, it can be done actually in quite a community-centric way, for example. And the same, I think, is the case in the UK around river health. People can be quite engaged in that and they can do stuff themselves. It's not just about water companies or agriculture or highways, there's opportunities for others to do stuff, but it's almost just how do we crack that very binary, this is a threat, net zero, whatever it might be, it's a threat, and actually connect exactly with what you said at the beginning, Zac, which is people really care about the environment, they care about nature, it's very local often to them, and just tell those stories in a way that cuts through the noise and cuts through the lobbying, arguably. That feels like the opportunity.
I think it is genuinely true to say that everything we need to do is already being done. Everything. It's just not being done all in the same place. And there are things that weren't even designed to be environmental, but because they're solid and sound and intelligent, they are environmental. Because, of course, an economy that destroys its basis, everything comes from nature, is not a very clever economy. It's not a sound economy. But you've got examples that go back years where, Cornish farmers are paid by water companies not to use pesticides because they don't want to have to pay money to get them out of the water later on. It's cheaper just to not have pesticides upstream. You've got other areas where water companies are and councils even now paying landowners to not farm on very steep hills because that causes runoff and encourages flooding. It's not an environmental policy. It is an environmental policy, but that's not why it was created. It was created just because it's sensible. It saves money. And there are many examples. And I remember, in my early days of environmental campaigning before being an MP or advising the Conservative Party, the big baddie at the time was Indonesia and palm oil. Everyone knows those awful images of orangutans fighting to hold on to the last tree as it's cut down by a bulldozer to make way for huge plantations. But today in Indonesia, it is almost the case, really genuinely very nearly the case, that the link between palm oil and deforestation has been broken. So palm oil is not a big contributor of deforestation in Indonesia today because the industries, for lots of different reasons, you had clever regulation from various governments, you had lots of campaign from consumers, including in demand countries like the US and UK and Europe and so on. The industry has got its act together. The same with pulp and paper. I remember the worst deforester in the world, I think at the time, was a company called APP, Asian Pulp and Paper. And a huge campaign was mounted against them. And because they only sell to the big companies, you and I couldn't boycott them. So the campaign cleverly went to their big buyers. Disney, for example, bought a lot of their paper and started putting pressure on them because they do have customers like you and me. And we can say to Disney, we don't like it. And it was just such an effective campaign. And the effect is that APP eventually had to come to the table, agreed just to stop hostilities, to leave us alone, stop campaigning against us, stop ruining us, losing us our customers like Disney, and we'll do a deal. And when they did it, they suddenly felt they were at a competitive disadvantage with all the other pulp and paper companies. They were doing the good stuff and everyone else was still doing the bad stuff. So they then took on the role of campaigner, and they lobbied the government to raise the regulations to a point where the rules applied fairly to everyone. Today, pulp and paper in Indonesia is, I'm not going to say it's not a problem, but it is definitely not. If you're campaigning on issues, it would be pretty low on the list. It's marginal impacts on the environment, and there's a lot of actual renewal and regeneration that's happening as a prerequisite. APP hasn't got a choice. It has to re-wet the peatlands. It has to re-establish native trees in areas that have been used. Almost anything's possible with the right approach. Costa Rica went from being one of the poorest countries in the Americas to one of the richest countries in the Americas. And at the same time, they doubled their forest cover. They decided, it was a political decision, an inspired leader at the time, our wealth is in our green gold, our natural riches. And they've been proven right. Politically stable. It hasn't been a coup since that decision was made decades ago, I think in the 50s. It is a reasonably prosperous, very stable, politically peaceful country that has benefited enormously. There's no choice between nature and progress, nature and development. That's a completely artificial choice, and one that's sort of been spuriously peddled quite often by the people who are destroying the nature. They're doing well out of it, but on the whole, people are not.
Yeah, it's foundational, isn't it, to society? I'm going to ask you one final question, Zac, and I ask all of my guests this. So we have a Planet Possible magic wand. I'm going to pass it across to you. You can give it a wave. You can make anything possible. What would you like to see?
Can I give you two answers?
Yes, you can.
Okay, only because one is a systemic thing. The problem today is that the market, the most powerful force for change, other than nature itself, doesn't recognize nature. The magic wand would make the market recognize and internalize the value of things which have value, on which we all depend. If you did that, everything would be fine. We wouldn't need to be having this conversation. Jane Goodall could have retired 40 years ago. David Attenborough could put his shoes up. That's the fundamental challenge, making the economy environmentally literate. Waste has a liability, resources have value, ecosystems are treasure. That's what needs to happen. Then the market becomes our friend, not our foe. But if you're talking about an individual campaign, just because I'm very keen for this to happen, I'm working very closely with lots of people, the Antarctic region needs to be made a marine protected area immediately. We've got to protect 30% of the world's ocean in a record period of time. That's a global agreement that we've all signed up to. We're nowhere near doing it, but that alone would take a huge chunk out of the problem. And it's such a pristine area. Big business hasn't been fully established there, so it should be possible to do. We need to persuade China, we need to persuade a couple of other countries as well, but we're making real progress, and that would be a wonderful thing. That would be the world's greatest wilderness. It would be the world's biggest conservation win in any of our lifetimes.
Well, I wish you the very, very best of luck with making that happen. It's not too late, and that's what's exciting about that. As ever, time always flies in these conversations. We're here at the end of another episode of Planet Possible. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found the conversation we've had insightful. I hope it's given you something to think about in your world. If you don't already, then subscribe to Planet Possible on your podcast app and we'll magically appear in your feed. We've got more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year, so I hope you'll join us for those too. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to our sponsors, Mackley, MWH Treatment and BMA, and to my excellent guest, Lord Goldsmith. Thank you so much, Zac.
Thank you so much, Nikki.
That's it, everyone. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.